It's good to see other people's faces on screen as well. Yeah, like Phoebe said, it'd be nice to see where everyone's from and where in the world you are. Is it sunny? Because it's not sunny in London, it's awful. I'm wearing a hoodie, it's July, I don't know what's going on, but you know, what can you do? I'm gonna share a presentation with you that me and John are gonna sort of introduce ourselves, what we do, why we did this report, some of the findings, and then we're gonna sort of talk about some of the recommendations that came out of that, tell you a little bit about what we are doing currently. There'll be a new government soon, hopefully. So there's some changes that might not be happening just yet, but we'll talk about them at the end. We've got time for questions, like Phoebe said. So yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks for joining us. I assume everyone can see my screen. Try not to do that thing where you're like, can everybody see my screen? But yeah, this is, yeah, we've got about an hour. So yeah, thanks for joining us. I'm gonna maybe start if we just introduce ourselves and who we are. I'm Antonia, pronouns they, them. I'm the COO at Come Play With Me, which is a music development organisation based in Leeds. I'm joined by John. You want to introduce yourself, John?
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm John Shortell, pronouns he, him. I'm Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for the Musicians Union.
Nice. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Come Play With Me and what we do, and then we'll sort of talk about why this report came about and what we're going to do with it. So like I said, Come Play With Me is a music development organisation. We're a CIC, so we don't work for profit. Some of you might be able to see Toni eating an apple there in the office. That's our office. Sorry to out you there, Toni. But we specialise in supporting people from marginalised communities to further their careers in music, whatever that looks like. Our mission is to fight for an equitable, inclusive and diverse music industry. So we do this in a number of ways. We have three very specific sort of strands to delivery. We have a label where we support marginalised artists with recording, releasing. We've got a partnership with EMI North at the moment, which is really good because it means that we can build a roster of artists for the first time in a way that we couldn't before. So we're building that roster out over the next few years, supporting people with like full album releases and marketing plans and all that kind of stuff that we weren't kind of able to do that before. We also run compilations. So we have two different types of compilation. One is a consistent call out that we have. And every year we release a compilation of marginalised identity artists. Usually that is LGBT people, women, people of colour. We then have a specific compilation that we run with an organisation called Breed, who do production. So they make records, make sleeves, they do a lot of our production. And they support us to do a specific EP for specific demographics. So the latest one is out very, very soon. You can see it on the slide there. Come Play With Breed Volume 2. So yeah, if you're interested in having a look at that and having a listen, then it's out very, very soon. We also run a number of events. So we have a conference that we run every year in Leeds, which is a space for people of marginalised identities and their allies to come together, talk about the music industry, learn more about different jobs, different roles, how to get involved and all that kind of thing. We also have a project called Come Platform Me, where we train up sound engineers, studio engineers, promoters, anyone that wants to do songwriting. We have like a 3 to 6 month program of support for people that want to work in the live industry somewhere. And then we have a magazine, which is very cool. We have a print magazine, which supports writers, photographers, creatives to create and produce a magazine. We talk about music in there. We don't do reviews strictly, but we talk about different parts of the industry, how people can get involved with different things. And we use it as a kind of way to talk about our work, but also national sort of artists and touring artists that are coming through Yorkshire and things like that as well. Cover stars have been Self-Esteem, Ezra Furman, Crawlers were on the last one. So we get a number of sort of bigger names to come and talk about their experience of music, and usually they're also people from marginalised identities and backgrounds. The biggest thing that we do, which is in support of this report, is our LGBT inclusion work. So we are a queer-led organisation, and we run several sessions and workshops for different audiences. supporting LGBT inclusion across their organisations. So we've worked with people like the Musicians Union in the past. We've done some sessions for youth music before, PRS, PPL, lots of different people across the sector to talk about sort of LGBT inclusion, how to embed that into your work, into your practice, into your venues or your festivals. We're very adaptable. We're very collaborative in that approach. So if there is someone that wants to talk about a specific project or a specific event, we can do consultation, we can do workshops with different parts of their teams and things like that. We've done some consultancy recently with BPI, who run the Brit Awards, and they're opening a new Brit school up north, which is very exciting. So we'll be talking to them about that soon as well. So that's the reason we kind of started working with the MU, was on that sort of LGBT inclusion and supporting their network groups within their organisation, and the partnership's really grown from there. And now I get to talk to John all the time, which is gorgeous. I'm going to let John actually talk about the Musicians Union now as well.
Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, we are what we say we are. We're the Musicians Union, so we're the trade union for musicians in the UK. We've just hit a really big milestone for us. Now we represent just over 35,000 musicians, and we work to protect our members' rights and campaign for a fairer, more equitable music industry in every sense of the word, equitable. So we help musicians across the sector, so whether you're employed, self-employed, freelance, and our members work in all areas of the music industry. So we represent orchestral musicians, gigging musicians, recording musicians, musicians who play in theatre, teachers, literally anywhere where musicians work, our members will be, which keeps the job really interesting because each specific sector will have its own kind of nuances and its own issues to kind of think creatively how we tackle them. And belonging to the Musicians Union as a member means that you are part of a collective of 35,000 musicians. So your issue becomes our issue. You're not going to tackle this alone. Quite often when our members have issues, they'll come to us and it's issues that we've got experience of dealing with in the past or that other members have experienced as well. So it just means being part of that wider community of musicians. It's not so isolating, and we're here to be your voice within the music industry and at the highest levels of government as well. So at the Musicians Union, equality, diversity, inclusion, or ED&I is a core part of our work, and obviously that's my job to make sure that we are representing marginalised musicians as they want to be represented. So we represent musicians from every section in society, but also understand that there's groups of musicians that are going to have more difficulties navigating the music industry. The way that we make sure that those musicians' voices are heard is we have member networks. So you can see them, network for musicians who experience racism, a network for LGBTQ plus members, disabled members network, a women's network, and a young members network. So these group of musicians are not just underrepresented within the music industry, but also within MU membership as well. So there's a lot of work happening to make sure that we're representative of those communities, that we're engaging with those communities, and their voices are at the heart of the work that we do at the MU. And the networks are the way that we do that. Really casual spaces, member-led spaces. So members get to talk about whatever they'd like to talk about. And then I go away with my colleague, Diljit, who's amazing, and speak to our elected committee, who are the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And we discuss how the MU are going to tackle the issue and how we're going to work on the issue, all with the focus of making a fair and more equitable music industry. So I think that explains a bit about who we are and how we work, especially in this space. The musician census, it was a massive project that we've wanted to do for years. But finding the time to do it and finding the right partner was a bit challenging. And then finally we come together with Help Musicians, who had the same vision of us. So it was to find out what the music industry looked like, who worked where and who was doing what, much broader than Musicians Union membership, or the people that help musicians work with as well. So we had this aim of a census-style survey that tells us, it was like a benchmarking exercise. So when we talk about the music industry, how many women are working in the industry, how many LGBTQ plus musicians are working in the industry, and what do they do? What issues do they face? So it was all those kinds of data points that we wanted to collect. And then we worked with a steering group, which Come Play With Me were part of, to help us reach underrepresented communities, to make sure that those voices were evident in the data as well, so we could really unpick it. We had an amazing response, almost 6,000 responses. So because we had so much data, we released a series of insight reports. So you can see there was one on women musicians, a report on mental well-being, a report on musicians from the global majority, and a financial insights report, as well as the LGBTQ plus report that we'll be discussing today. There's also a future report on disabled musicians. To my knowledge, this is the first time there's been a report focused specifically on LGBTQ plus musicians with this level of data and insight. Certainly the first time I think that we've had data on trans musicians. And I know Tony is going to talk a bit about that next.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting, there's a few different reports about general sort of diversity across the music industry. The UK music is obviously one that comes out every sort of other year, and they've started asking about trans status in that report. So within other people's data sets, there are little hints of LGBT inclusion. There are little hints of things about trans people specifically, but there isn't really and hasn't really been any sort of deep dive research into the LGBT community within the music industry, where they are, what sort of level they're working at, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where this thinking came from in terms of why that's needed. And I think a lot of the time, particularly for us as a sort of queer-led music development organisation, quite naturally, a lot of the people that come to us are also part of the queer community or part of the LGBT community somewhere. And that quite naturally happens for us, I think, because of the leadership that we have. And actually, like, you know, out of the people that we talk to, we know from the people that we work with that there isn't much in terms of representation across the industry for people working in the industry, specifically people that see themselves in certain roles or know that certain roles exist and stuff like that. But there isn't that research to back up those stories. The stories are great, and the stories are really key to telling other people how things can be improved. But without that sort of baseline of statistics and things like that, it's very difficult to do that work and lobby kind of senior managers and government and things like that for that change. So yeah, it's been really good to have this data set where we can now look at people's experiences and be like, well, now we can find some ways of changing that and improving things for people in the future. So the report really shares people's experiences and gives a lot of like detail on how people are experiencing the music industry or not experiencing it, depending on kind of, you know, who they are and where they sit. There's some of the key findings from that I'm going to go through, and there's sort of like 6 key stats that I've pulled out for this session in particular. There's a few things in here. If you've got any reflections on them, like, feel free to pop them in the chat. But 53% of the trans respondents from this, 6,000 people, 53% of the people within that identified as trans have experienced discrimination based on their gender identity. 90% of the people that reported low mental well-being also reported either experiencing or witnessing some form of discrimination, and 41% of LGBT musicians have experienced gender discrimination. And I think what's interesting about these 3 stats in particular is the bit about witnessing discrimination. In the report, there's a lot of experiences of discrimination, but the bigger percentages of people that have witnessed it as well. So I think the effect on people's mental well-being and general well-being from both experiencing and witnessing other people going through discrimination is really a key thing to pull out of this, in terms of kind of how different people might experience different spaces. Particularly musicians, if you're thinking about people that are going on tour, they might be, you know, away from their support networks and things like that because they're out in a different country or they're in a different part of the UK or they don't know anyone, or, you know, particularly people that are working freelance, you know, a lot of those things, you don't have someone to report those things to. And throughout the report, you'll also see that a lot of the discrimination that people tell us about, they also didn't report to anybody, either because they didn't want to or because those people might not exist in order to report to. So yeah, when you're thinking about these stats, I think it's good to think about how and where people might be, necessarily like geographically, but whereabouts they might be in terms of life as well. 3 more stats on this around being self-employed. So 70%, I touched on this just now, but like 70% of the respondents were self-employed. So like I said, they don't have anywhere to report things to. They don't have a HR necessarily if they're freelance. A third of LGBT musicians work in other sectors outside music for financial reasons. So when you tap into things like class background and you think about how many people are maybe struggling financially as well for various reasons, there's an intersectionality there of kind of the income that people might have and where that comes from. And it's not necessarily always music, even though their sort of prime focus for their career is being a musician. Only 15% of trans respondents make 100% of their income from music out of all the trans respondents that we had. So the rest of those people make their income elsewhere as well. So a lot of people are kind of unable to fully concentrate all their efforts into making music, recording, touring, all that kind of stuff that you would expect. So yeah, there's a lot of intersections within the report. So if you go through some of those things in the sort of end of that report, there's a lot of stuff around working class backgrounds, whether people are people of colour, living with disabilities, etc. There's lots of different nuance within that. But yeah, any sort of reflections on these stats as we go along would be great. There's a few recommendations that we came up with, and I'll let Don speak to these because I think a lot of them are kind of in flux at the moment. There's obviously things going on this week that might change some of this policy review and some of the recommendations that we sort of came up with together. But yeah, there's a few things that hopefully you'll be able to take out of this as well for yourselves.
Thanks, Tony. So one thing that come out of the report quite clearly is that LGBTQ plus musicians experience higher rates of ill mental health or ill mental well-being. And like Tony was saying before, it's fantastic for us to have the data because while anecdotally we might know this, to have the data enables us to lobby government for culturally relevant and informed mental health services for LGBTQ plus musicians, but also the industry to say to them when we have organisations that specifically look after musicians' mental health, are these culturally appropriate? Are we treating all musicians the same, or are we being culturally responsive to the groups that need it most or might have different needs? So we can have those really nuanced conversations with the data points. It's not just about collecting the data. For me, it's about what does the data tell us to do? How can the data help us make interventions that make the industry more equitable? And we were at an LGBTQ plus conference last week, actually, with our members discussing this issue. And it's an organisation called the TUC that represents all the trade unions in the UK, I think, or most trade unions. And our ask of them was to lobby the incoming government for the first paragraph on this slide for culturally relevant LGBTQ plus mental health services. So really important one, but as Tony was saying, yeah, we're a bit like, we have to wait and see now what's going to happen tomorrow, and then it probably won't be a priority for until a cabinet's formed and things like that. But it's definitely a priority for us, so we'll be holding the feet to the fire on these recommendations, whoever the new government is. The industry is where I think we'll be able to have the easier conversations on this. So certainly for us, we see initiatives like Power Up is a really great example where that's focused on a specific group, Black musicians, where they're marginalised, underrepresented in the music industry, and there's funding and investment into a programme to support that group to progress. And we've seen already they're on year 4 now, and the amazing things that cohort of musicians and managers and industry professionals have been able to do with that additional support. So it's real evidence that these targeted funded schemes work really, really well. And what we'd like to see is a similar scheme to support the progression of LGBTQ plus musicians. So exactly the same model as Power Up. How can we replicate the success of that for this community? And I should say we're always thinking intersectionally about this. Tony mentioned it before, so we're looking at this through the lens of class, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, disability, just to make sure that we're not missing anything, that we're having those nuanced conversations. The last one's really interesting about CSED, the Creative Independent Standards Authority. I'm not going to say loads about it, but basically that will be like, like the Advertising Standards Authority for like the advertising world. CSED is going to be like that for the creative industries. For me, it can't happen soon enough. Our industry is really unregulated. There's a lot of discriminatory, bad behaviour, illegal behaviour that goes unchecked because we haven't got it regulated in this industry. It's a really interesting project and hopefully up and running by the end of the year. Sorry, I started talking backwards then, didn't I, Tony? Thank you. And then these are some of the things that we've started to put in place already. So with Come Play With Me and organisations like Music Managers Forum, we've created a queer-led kind of network for the community by the community called Music Plus. And that doesn't exist because you'll notice like most kind of ED&I things, or a lot of them, are for someone else. So there'll be like you'll see like businesses attending Pride and things like that, and it makes the business look good through optics. This network is by our community for our community, so it's not to kind of promote LGBTQ people in the industry. It's for us to meet other LGBTQ plus people. So we had a really successful first meetup at Brighton in Brighton a couple of months ago. I think there was about 40 of us there. We'll be doing more of those kinds of community building spaces throughout the year. So I think the next one that we've got planned is in Manchester in October. Where a clear theme that come out the centres was a need for community spaces. So our role as the MU is to kind of facilitate those spaces for our membership and the wider communities, and working with partners like Come Play With Me enables us to do that, and enables us to make sure that we're reaching the right audiences as well. Some of the other things in there, really simple things that the industry can do, but without a push or support, they're not going to do it themselves. So review the language that we use to make sure it's inclusive of all LGBTQ plus people. I mean, the most obvious one is when we're introducing people and we say ladies and gentlemen. How do we reframe that to make sure it's inclusive of everyone? It's really simple steps, but if people aren't thinking of these ways, or people aren't supporting them to think in these ways, then it's generally not happening. So again, we're supporting the industry to do that with Come Play With Me, who run those sessions. Toni ran a fantastic session for us last week for the orchestral sector. And it was, I think it's safe to say, probably the first time some of them had access to LGBT inclusion training. It was a really interesting discussion. And I don't know how much anyone knows about that sector, but it's quite gendered, or traditionally has been quite gendered. So it's really interesting to start to unpick the ways in which we can improve that for LGBTQ plus people.
Do you know what? One of the things that I found really interesting about that session was that it's easy to forget, I think, because I work in a lot of sort of indie music, guitar music kind of areas often, that it's easy to forget that other sort of genres of music or sectors of music operate in a completely different way.
Yeah.
And the real gendered like world of orchestra and opera and all those kind of spaces is like so traditional and so different to maybe like DIY gigs in South London that I'd usually go to and spend a lot of my time in. And like, yeah, I think it's when we talk about language and having that shared language across all of the sectors of music and live music, it's quite jarring sometimes when you go like possibly as a non-binary person or a trans person to somewhere like a theatre, and the sort of the thing comes up, it's like, ladies and gentlemen, take your seats, and you're like, what, me? Where? Where am I going? And yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about that, like it's not necessarily where most people will spend their time in certain places, but it's there and it exists, and it does need to be more inclusive to make those. And
100%.
again, plays into a lot of other intersections, doesn't it, in terms of like class background and who's in those spaces, what kind of people are in those spaces, what demographics are there and stuff like that. So yeah.
It's really interesting. It's kind of not a natural fit, or wasn't a natural fit for me, like the orchestral sector when I first started doing this job. So it was interesting to learn how they work and how it's so rooted in tradition, and the challenges that gives us in terms of LGBT inclusion. Even conversations around like the conversations that we have at work with everyone, where they're like, oh, have you got a boyfriend? Have you got a girlfriend? Have you got a family? And how reframing that to like, well, how do we have those conversations in a way that enables LGBT plus people to be honest about who they are, to be open at work? Because one of the things we found through the census is not everyone feels that they can be out at work. And obviously we want to create those safe workplaces for our members, for all musicians, where you can talk about your family, where you can have those conversations, and you're not consistently having to come out because we're not asked in a way that forces us into saying, oh, well, actually, I've got a boyfriend, or my partner's non-binary, or whatever that like is set up may be. So it's really interesting. And obviously there's dress codes and things there that people are moving away from, but they still exist. So it's like looking at it in a way that's holistic, and we can move the sector in the right direction, to make it more diverse and inclusive. One of the things that we really want to focus on, and that we have a young members network, is making sure youth voice is at the heart of this work. So who are the musicians that are going to work in this space that we're trying to create these safe spaces for? What do they think? What would they like us to do? It's work as a trade. Trade unions don't necessarily always prioritize youth voice, I've got to be honest. So it's something that we've learned along the way, and we've got a person who specifically looks after our young members, Maddie, to make sure that the voice is evident in everything that we do. So yeah, it's about, we looked at the census and we found younger people were much more likely to identify in other ways than straight or identify within the gender binary. And that was really interesting for us to think about, okay, how do we future-proof these workplaces for this group of musicians who are up and coming? Tony, do you want to say anything about that? Because I know we had some really interesting conversations about that data, didn't we, at the time? Or am I
Yeah, I was
just
going to
putting you on the spot now?
So one of the other sort of aspects of what I do and what we do at Complain With Me is working with other sectors. So sometimes we'll go into more corporate settings or like not necessarily music. And that sort of exists, that issue exists across all sectors, lots of different people, whether that is law firms and banks and, you know, all those kind of places, but also healthcare and NHS trusts and all those places. They're looking at their recruitment and sort of looking at the people that are being recruited through graduate schemes or coming out of university or college. And actually, like, there's a stat around the amount of people that currently, like, anyone under 25, 44%, I think 45% of them identify something other than straight. So if you think about the amount of people that are identifying in other ways, that are young, that are coming into different industries, I think it's really important to have that representation and that sort of openness in your organization, whether that is a bank, a law firm, a healthcare situation, whatever, that people feel able to be themselves and able to go, not just have a seat at the table, but be able to speak when they get there, you know. And like, those changes aren't going to happen overnight, but a lot of these recommendations, particularly for the music industry, are going to be really key to that future proofing that John was just talking about in terms of who represents the industry in 15, 20, 30 years. There might be small changes here that we don't see make a massive impact in our lifetime, but it's about making those little changes now.
Yeah.
That's going to
It is, and moving us forward, isn't it? I think there's the sometimes the creative industries are looked on as like a safe space for LGBTQ plus people, and we hear that a lot. But obviously the census data telling us a very different story, and we know this anyway through the MU, through doing our work with members who report stuff to us. So I think when there's that kind of myth, you can become complacent as someone who works in the creative industries to think, oh, well, we're okay because we're open to everything. Like, I've been told, like, oh, the gay mafia run the music industry and all this. I was like, oh, introduce me to this gay mafia. I'd love to meet them. Like, because from my experience, that's just not true. So I think, yeah, when we have this data, it allows us to challenge those myths and say, actually, this is work that we do need to do because look at the experiences of this group of musicians. Yeah, and as Tony was saying, making sure that those challenges don't exist for the next kind of generation. Is there any more recommendation slides?
Yeah, the last bit about kind of attitude and accountability generally, I think these are sort of more general kind of culture change, and these are the things I think that do take a long time. Like, that culture change is something that takes a long time. Like, you can change a policy in a couple of weeks in your workplace. You can lobby government, and, you know, a couple of years later something will change, hopefully. But that sort of culture change and creating those spaces really does take more time and more thought, and it's not going to happen overnight. Building that trust with different communities as organizations, particularly in creative industries, takes a long time. And that's what these last few recommendations are about, like that culture of disclosure. Like we said, like in the report, lots of people told us stuff, but it wasn't stuff that they necessarily reported to someone. There wasn't that kind of place that they could go to tell someone that this has happened, or how do I deal with this, or, you know, how do I feel safer and stuff like that. And then, you know, there's the general sort of recommendation to the government to intensify their efforts to support LGBT people generally, internationally, across the world and things like that. I talk a lot about the ILGA Europe map, and I show it to everybody because it's such a useful tool if you're touring as a musician, if you're working with musicians that you're taking on tour, that you're sending away somewhere to play music or play at a festival internationally. It's just a really good tool to have. I'll pop it in the chat in a second, but it sort of lists out all the countries of Europe in order of whether or not they're good for LGBT people and the provision is good or the provision is bad. And it talks about everything, and it gives you the sort of knowledge of where different places are of support that you can get in those different countries. So it's a really good, yeah, there you go. Baz has just popped it in the chat. The rainbow map is great. Love it. I recommend it to everyone that works in music and creative industries. And then, yeah, John's just popped a thing in there as well about travel advice for LGBT musicians. So there's a lot of stuff that I think we need our government, our incoming government, to work with LGBT organisations internationally across Europe and stuff like that. So there's a wider piece of work there. You know, there's the smaller stuff that we talk about that we can recommend in terms of training, development for teams, making sure you're using inclusive language, all that kind of stuff. But then there's also the recommendations like this that are much wider, bigger scope of like lobbying government and working in a traditional sort of trade union way with the musicians union. So, yeah. We have time for questions. If anybody has anything that they want to ask about either our work, John's work, the report, anything in general, or anything anybody wants to share as well, would be great.
Hello, I'm Taya. I work for AMP Music in North Yorkshire, and we're a youth music development charity. And we focus a lot on youth voice as well. And I would love to hear, like specifically about your work with your Young Musicians Network on this sort of area, and like how that consultation has worked and kind of and things like that, because it's just really useful to know other people's practice with youth voice and just, yeah, how that's all worked for you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for that question. So we've got off the top of my head, I can't tell you how many young members we've got in the network, but I know it's a robust network and it's looked after by my colleague Maddie, who runs our campaigns. And we felt it was useful to sit there because exactly for the reason we wanted youth voice coming through in our campaigns, in our language, in everything we do. So we have reserved seats on our committees to make sure that we've got equal representation or proportionate representation. So we'll have that for any underrepresented musician on our section committees. So like theatre section, live section. My committee is a little bit different because by its very nature, it's going to be more diverse, but we'll do that to ensure youth voices coming through. So for instance, if we are running a campaign, like we're going to be launching a campaign quite shortly, we'll consult our young members on the language we use, on ideas, what they think we should prioritize in the campaign. Some consultations are more successful than others, but that tells us a lot when people aren't engaging with the consultation. Maybe it's pitched wrong, maybe it's the wrong idea, maybe it's totally wrong. We learn a lot from engaging with the network. So yeah, every opportunity that we can, we engage with that network in a consultative way. And as I said, we make sure that youth voice is evident on our committees as well. I've got to be honest, we've got loads more work to do on embedding youth voice. I'm acting like it's perfect. We're not at all. We've got loads to do. We've got so many young members, and I feel like in terms of the proportional representation, there should be more engaged in our networks. I guess the trade union movement as a whole may be a bit, it maybe lends itself more to older workers, or certainly they feel more established within the trade union movement. So we've got loads of work to do to make sure like we're making sure that's not the narrative that the MU kind of perpetuates to our members. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And like you say, I think it's really good to hold yourself in that position where you're constantly improving the way that you do it, because obviously, you know, I think it's not getting complacent and also just responding to what young people need and like the time they have to commit to stuff, ways of engaging them. I went to a really brilliant conference with Sound Connections down in London, which was called A Seat at the Table.
Yeah.
It was all about inclusion. I don't know if any of you were there or part of it, but they did some amazing stuff of like the young people that they'd worked with kind of like actually curating panels and leading those panels and kind of having this really active role in it. So they've been consulted on what they'd like to see, but then they were also part of making it. And I think that was really powerful. So yeah, that was really good practice from Sound Connections for sure.
It's exactly that, isn't it? Because when I have conversations about diversity, I'm always when I'm talking to organisations, thinking, are you talking about seats around the table? Are you talking just about faces, or are we talking about a shift in power? So have as a diverse committee as you want, but do those people feel psychologically safe to say what they wanted to say? Have they got power to make change? Because if they haven't, to me, it's meaningless then. So when we're looking at our ways, it's like, are we creating these spaces where someone's going to speak up? And if not, what can we do to ensure that they do speak up? So for us, it might be making sure that the chair, this sounds so trade union-y, I'm sorry, if this is boring, just say stop. But say the chairs of the committees will make sure that the gender balanced, or that it's a diverse a chair and vice chair and another vice chair. So again, it's making sure that there's people who have got representation, who've got power in our committee, and people can see themselves represented within our membership, within our committees, within the staff that work at the MU. There's a massive piece of work to make sure that we reflect our membership as well. So it is, look, it's a long journey and it's loads of work. And like I said, we're not perfect, but we're learning all the time. And it's from our members and meeting people like yourselves and having these conversations. But I'm definitely always where, like, when we talk about diversity, I'm not interested unless we're talking about a shift in power, unless we're talking about psychological safety. That's the bit that's really going to make change, I think.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to put in the chat, if I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but there's an organisation called Young Trustees Movement, who do like a free training every month about getting young people into boards and places and like governance level. Oh, look, there it is. Oh, the super hard songs. So yeah, this is great, and like the training's really good. And they also have this model boardroom series for people to go on as well. So if you've got any young people in organizations who might want to progress but need time to like get ready, like when we've got 5 young trustees on our board, but we've tried to like make that process gradual. So they might have been a participant and then done some consultation and then got to governance, rather than chucking them in at the deep end where they have that psychological safety. And this is part of the training we provide them. So it's really good if anyone's not seen that before.
Oh, thank you. I hadn't seen that, but that's amazing. Thank you. I'm going to look at that.
That was slicker than I expected it to be. I was shocked.
I wanted to ask about sort of, because the group that I work at Creative United, where we run a scheme called Take It Away, which allows people to get access to musical instruments, which is great, and it's all about accessibility and about kind of allowing people to have access to instruments who might have barriers towards that. And in the past, we've definitely focused on young people getting hold of instruments, and we've had kind of more of a connection with kind of people who have disabilities or access requirements. And there's almost more of a like logical link there, where it's like, okay, if someone needs an adaptive instrument, it might be more expensive, therefore our financial services help them. But I'm trying to think, like, obviously a huge part of what we're trying to do is making music more accessible, and that includes queer people. But seeing where we take those steps is harder to do, I guess, in those situations. So I'm like, what should I be doing? Should I be talking to our like credit providers, trying to make sure the forms are more inclusive in language? Should it be our connection to music shops that I focus on? And I'm just interested in your ideas of like where the most helpful help would be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because it's like it's much harder to quantify why someone would need an instrument based on their queer identity, rather than like it being adaptive or it being a cost thing. And I think probably like if you took this report, you could probably pick out some of the sort of intersections there of LGBT people are less likely to be financially stable generally. That's sort of that's more of a general thing. There's a few other reports in terms of like the Stonewall's LGBT in Britain report, which talks about finance and like how LGBT people experience like financial hardship in a way that maybe other people don't, and things like that. So I think you could it would be a little bit of work in terms of finding those bits of research and stuff, but definitely those intersections there of like, I mean, one of the things that John pointed out at the beginning of this was how LGBT people are more likely to experience poor mental health. If they're more likely to experience poor mental health, then it's probably likely that they're more likely to be in precarious work situations or on 0 hours contracts, or, you know, working 2 or 3 jobs and not able to find the time to learn how to play the piano. Or maybe they grew up in a household where there wasn't a cello, or there wasn't a guitar, or there wasn't, you know, things that they needed in order to learn those things in the first instance. So I think there's that kind of picking up on the intersectionalities in terms of like why you're doing that work and why it's a service you need to offer to people. But equally, like the stuff that you suggested around making sure you're asking for pronouns on forms and like all that kind of stuff is really key as well, to making sure that people feel like the service that they're using is for them or is for people like them as well. I don't know if anybody else has got any other suggestions. I mean, yeah.
I suppose part of it is because we have access to like a big network of music retailers as well. So I suppose that's helpful to us in terms of we can get feedback. Like we can't always talk to our customers like that directly, which is part of the problem, but we can sort of give resources to the music retailers and we can hear back from them what's working and what isn't. So I suppose that's part of it as well. And it did make me think what you just said about, I remember during lockdown, a lot of my friends who are queer, who are working in the arts, in performance or music, were talking about how so much of the work they do is just like job by job and it's not got job security. And so it does link in that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think it's also worth looking at those retailers that you work with. Like, what are their brand values? What are their sort of what are their focuses in terms of EDI? Because if you're working with a retailer whose HR team are thinking we need to be looking at our queer customer base and growing that, then that's great. You've got that sort of link there. There is always in bigger organizations or retailers or like brands, there is always someone with there is always a focus. There's a yearly focus, a 3-year focus, whatever, and there is usually a strand of EDI to that. So I think a lot of it as well is like working out what their priorities are and how you can tap into that in terms of like, okay, well, if you're working on like if you want to support the global majority as a brand, we can help you do that by giving your instruments to people from the global majority that we know. There's always that sort of like tapping into their priorities, working out what it is they want to do, and then sort of bending a little bit to that, which is something I think we sort of look at often with Come Play With Me, is like, are these organisations supporting queer people? If not, why not? And have they thought about it? Should they be doing that? And the answer is usually yes, they should be doing that. As with everything. But I think it's about tapping into what they're already thinking as well, and what their sort of priorities are as well.
We do that a lot with the MU and the people we work with. We have a set of values and we like, does this company align with MU values? And if not, then the next question is, well, can we support them to make sure that they're doing better work through an ED in Ireland, for example? So that's kind of our approach, and we're becoming much more consistent with that and looking, rather than saying, no, we're not going to work with that organization or that company. I guess the next stage of that is, have we got the resource and capacity to help you improve, to support you to do better? So like with music publishers, for instance, who might have to publish music or work with parts of the world that are hostile to LGBT people, while the business still has to operate in that place for the business to function. What can you do to kind of, not offset is the wrong word, but what are you doing to support LGBT people in that region? Could your organization make a donation to an LGBT charity in that region or something along those lines? So we're working a lot more like that to see like how we can have a broader impact.
That's interesting as well, because we do like provide accessibility resources when we take on new members. Like if people don't have an accessibility statement, we like give them a template for that and advice about it, but we don't have anything to do with like queerness in that. So that might be something to like think about, to see like what we could provide to our members when they get onboarded. Thank you.
Thanks.
I work in kind of early years and work with community musicians, and I just wanted to ask, has anyone here done any work around inclusivity in early years, I guess, with community musicians who may be LGBTQ plus, or and also kind of rainbow families, and just making that a welcome space?
You know what? We've got a project that's really early days that we haven't released yet, but I can still talk about it, about like how we make, we're starting with vocal tuition. So how we make vocal tuition more inclusive to LGBTQ plus people. So again, that's a heavily gendered kind of space to work in, isn't it? When we talk about like female and male voices, what if you're outside that binary, and how do we find different ways, considering that that's so rooted in tradition, to talk about voices to make everyone feel included. It's really early days, like I said, but we've got a specialist who works with trans musicians, trans singers specifically, to kind of look across the board for us and start making suggestions on how we can move to a more inclusive approach. So it's underway. It's a difficult one because I guess you're navigating so many different kind of identities and personalities within that space. And then there's parents on top of the students that you've got to deal with. It's complicated, that, isn't it?
It's complex and it's so embedded in learning, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like even when my kids went to nursery, just being very aware of like all of the language that's used and how rooted that is. Yeah.
My old job before this was for doing this job in education. So I'm quite familiar with kind of that landscape. And I remember when we were talking about the relationship and sex education consultation, which is still going on now. And the pushback was mainly coming from parents, and the youth voice was saying, oh no, we actually want this in quite an inclusive way. So there's a kind of a perception gap, I think, between what young people want and what parents think that young people want or think that they should have access to. And that's really difficult to navigate as a tutor or teacher, isn't it?
Yeah. They'll be interested in the project as it develops if you've got
100%. We'll publish it, and obviously we'll let Youth Music know when it's published. But yeah, we really want to get this one right to make sure that we're supporting our members who teach to be as inclusive as possible. But I guess the other thing you've got me thinking now is the other part is how to have that conversation with parents as well, isn't it? In an inclusive but respectful way. Okay, I'll keep you updated on how that project goes.
It's interesting as well. I mean, it's not early years, but I think I talk to a lot of organisations that work with young people generally, and a lot of those young people might be LGBT but not out at home. So I think some of it is also about like creating that space where people can be themselves and can talk about things in a way that in a way that they feel safe to be able to do that. And it might be somewhere, it might be the only place the music club they go to on a Saturday afternoon might be the only place that they can talk about or feel able to talk about their identity in a way that they might not feel safe to do so at home and things like that. So I think there's a few things around like creating that space for people, but also, that balance is difficult sometimes. And Any other questions from anyone or reflections on anything?
If not, I'm just going to launch a quick evaluation survey, if that's all right, just at how people felt about today's session. I thought it was really good. Thank you so much, Toni and John.
Thank you
for talking us through that.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome. Yeah, it'd be great if people could complete that, but otherwise happy to finish a little bit early. That's always nice, isn't it? Anyway.
I'll send the links to the report and everything to you, Phoebe, and then
great. I've got all the ones open that was sort of shared, so I'll send an email around with all the links and stuff. Which is
and Phoebe, do feel free to share my email if anyone's got questions about the work of the MU or about the report or anything. That I'm happy to keep in touch with everyone.
Amazing.
Yeah, same. If you want to share my email address as well, that's cool. I'm happy to chat through anything with anybody. So
thank you.